Hello, it's David Clarke here from DVC Training, and I want to give you a quick run through on the new features of Edius X, which was released on the 15th of September 2020. There are more in-depth videos on these features on the EDIUSNet website. This is meant to be a quicker introduction into the new features and a couple of things they may not have mentioned. I've only had Edius X for a very short while, so there will be more in-depth information coming out in the future. Like Edius 8 and Edius 9, you will be getting more new features in Edius X through its lifetime. If you bought it, you'll be getting those for free, so there will be more features coming. These are just the new features that are with Edius X on its release in September 2020. So we have a couple of new major features. Background rendering and exporting has been added, so now when you start to export or render something, it'll carry on doing it whilst you carry on working. We've got motion tracking in the layouter, so if you want to take something and tie it to another thing on, like a title that you want to make follow a person as he moves across the screen, you can now do that inside of Edius. Previously we had motion tracking in the mask filter, but you couldn't use it on a different layer. Well, now you can. We've got the ability to use an NVIDIA graphics card to export H.265. Previously you could only do that if you had Intel QuickSync. Now the QuickSync stuff's all still there and the same as before, but now you can use an NVIDIA as well. Now, that's the only thing the NVIDIA card is adding. It's not adding the same kind of acceleration as QuickSync, so it's still worth having QuickSync, but maybe something like that will come in the future. Right now what we've got is H.265 export with an NVIDIA. We've also got a big change to do with audio, in that if you were using VST plugins in older versions of Edius, some of them worked, some of them caused an audio sound delay, put things out of sync by a couple of frames. That's been fixed, so most audio VST plugins shouldn't cause you a sync delay anymore, which is great. We've also got a couple of extras that are coming with Edius 10, so these are Vitascene LE, which is a bunch of fancy transitions and glowy and sparkly effects and movie looks. You've got New Blue Titler Pro 7, which is an updated version of the titler that used to come with Edius 9, except 7's got a lot more filters and a lot more control. And you've also got some new audio plugins which have been written specifically for Edius, and these ones are things like a compressor, a denoiser, a de-echoer or deverberator, and a limiter. So these are things that we've been dying to have in Edius for ages. Now we've got some that have been added in, and basically you're listening to the results right now because I've been using them during this edit. These new filters and effects, which are made by people other than Grass Valley, so third parties, these are available to everybody that buys Edius X, and also anybody that qualifies for a free upgrade because they bought Edius 9 during the last few months. So for quite some time now, Grass Valley have been saying, look, if you buy Edius 9 you'll get Edius 10 free. Well, all these extras will go to those guys as well. You just have to download them and install them. If you did buy Edius in the qualifying period, obviously you're going to need to download the new version. Now you can keep Edius 9 on the system as well as Edius 10, so they are designed to coexist, and you might want to because there's a couple of things that have been removed from Edius 9, old kind of legacy stuff. I mean, particularly things like DV capture you can't do in Edius 10 anymore, so you might want to keep Edius 9 around just for that. No problem, you can do that as well. But to get Edius 10 you're going to make sure you've got your Edius Plus serial number. Got a link to it on my website, but go to the web page and make sure you get your Edius Plus number, because you've got until the end of September to do this, and if you don't, then you won't be able to get your free Edius 10. It's been available for some time. You should have done it as soon as you got your Edius 9 anyway, but if you haven't, please go ahead and do it before you miss out. So once you've installed Edius X, Vitascene, the audio effects and New Blue Titler aren't installed, and you have to download them separately. They're not part of the main Edius download. Easiest way to get them is to go up to the Help heading and choose Download Edius X bonus content. That will take you to a web page, and from there you can then download the audio effects, video transitions and so on. You'll also see from the help menu there, that's where you can download the latest DVD menu styles. Edius still writes DVDs, hasn't really changed on that at all, exactly the same as before, but you want the latest menus, so go to there and download it as well. Anyway, enough of an introduction, let's get into looking at the new features of Edius X, and the first thing I'm going to have a look at is the new background rendering. So I've got a couple of clips here on the timeline, and maybe I'm going to put some kind of effect on here that needs rendering. Just grab a little Vitascene effect. So I've just added a bit of heavenly glow here from Vitascene LE, which is included. Okay, well, it happens to be playing it live at the moment anyway, but suppose I needed to render it. Normally what I would have done is right-clicked and chosen render, and then have to wait for it to render, and then be able to get on with my work. Well, now you do exactly the same thing. Right-click and render. It goes purple, but you can actually carry on working. So you notice here, obviously going off and trimming this clip and sticking another one on there. And opening up, and in the background, Edius is actually doing some encoding. It's actually rendering that clip. Now you might have noticed that whilst I was fiddling here, this has gone from purple to green. It's actually been rendered and I didn't even notice. It's done it using a thing which is called the GV Job Monitor. So we have a separate program that now does all the encoding. If you actually go to export or anything, you don't do it directly. It all goes off to this thing and it does it for you. So it'd be exactly the same if I decided to print a file. Let's just go out, export, print a file, and then choose a format, set it up, started exporting. Now it's actually been sent off to the GV Job Monitor and I can carry on working, and that's being made up. The GV Job Monitor puts this little purple icon down on the timeline here, which says something's going on, and another little purple icon turns up in the taskbar down here. Now you can bring it up just by clicking on that, and it will bring the Job Monitor up for you and show you what's going on. Or you can go up to Tools and Job Monitor, and it'll bring it up for you. And you can see here what I've got is a list of the jobs that have been done so far. Now you might say, hang on David, you have rendered something and then you've exported something. It's only showing one thing down here and you've done two things. That's because as a default, it doesn't show you everything. It just shows you the things that you will probably want to see most. Like you'll probably never want to go and find a render file, but you will want to go and find the MP4 file that I've just made up. So it shows me the export, it's not showing me the renders. I can change it just by going up to Settings and View. And here you have an option to decide whether you just show the export jobs or whether you show all jobs. And now you can see the things that have been done. This one here is something I'd done previously. As a default, it won't show you the fact the renders have been done, but they are getting done. And what happens if I just leave that there for a second and go to this one, say render, and then open up the job monitor, you'll notice it'll come in at the top here. It'll tell you what it is, say what's going on, up will pop something saying it's happening, and then once it's finished, it comes down here. Now I'm going to put it back to the default of just showing exports. So let's go back here. I'm going to make a very simple change. Set it to render again. Go back to the job monitor. You notice I can't see it, but it is still actually being rendered just because I've turned off notifications about renders. But all exports and all renders are now done through the GV job monitor. They're not done directly, which means you can carry on working. You don't have to. If you do carry on working, then it will slow down the GV job monitor, so exports will take longer. I haven't actually done any direct tests to see if it actually takes longer anyway than just choosing regular print to file, but I've done quite a few and been very happy with it. So let's take a closer look at just doing a bit of an export. I'm going to go and export this entire timeline. I'm going to choose H.265 and NVIDIA because I have an NVIDIA card and I can do H.265 on NVIDIA cards right now. Well, you'll see here, this is the regular print to file dialog box, and I've chosen my output settings. Normally what I do is just go export, give it a name, choose my settings, click save, and off it would go. Now that job has popped up in the job monitor here. You can see the progress as it goes through. I can pause it, so you highlight the job and then click pause or start. So you can stop the job monitor working completely at all if you're finding it's interfering with your playback, and then let it get on with the job afterwards. But effectively, once it's done, the job pops down here and it's finished. The most useful field I found here is actually this one, export file path, because it always reminds me what the job was. I found if I was doing quite a few exports in the background, I'd end up with a long list, and at some points I've forgotten, hang on, what was I doing there? What was I doing there? Well, this one will tell you what the file name is that you're creating. All these other things like the job name, that's generated automatically. So it tells you when it went in there and it tells you what the sequence was and what the project was. But I've actually found that one the most useful, and I tend to just make it bigger so I can see it. But there we are. I've now made an H.265 file from the timeline whilst I was yakking. In all versions of Edius up to now, once you've made something, it would go into the bin automatically. and then you would start using it in the project or doing whatever you like with it. That doesn't happen now. Because the GV monitor thing works in the background, things do not automatically go into the bin. So if you want it back in Edius, the thing to do is right-click on the output and either say Show in Player, which will pop it up there, or Add to Bin, which puts it in the bin just like it used to. Again, doesn't do it automatically, you have to choose one of those two options. Just a quick reminder here, this is what's happening in the very first release of Edius X. This might change in future versions, we don't know. Now I've put it in the bin, I can right-click on it and choose Explorer, and it finds it for me in Windows. Ta-da! There are a few different things up here, but mostly completely ignore it and just let it get on with stuff. You will have noticed that when I went to Export and Print File, there's an extra thing in here about job settings. This thing about captions, that was already there in Edius 9, but it's this stuff here, job settings, which is new. Effectively, if I'm going to do a job, I can decide on the priority, so that basically says when it goes into the list, does it go high priority or low? You can change that afterwards. If you've got a huge list of stuff, you can change the priority and the order that they're doing it in the job list, or you can set it here. And the other thing is you can add a comment. Like, so let's put that in as a high priority test export, give it another name, and in it pops, just right click on the top here and put in comment, and then you can see my comment there, which will again help me to identify it later on if I happen to be doing lots of stuff. Down here, right click, comment, yep, I can see that here as well. Apart from that, all the other export options that you were used to in Edius 9 are still there, so you've got all the same file types, with the addition of H.265 using the NVIDIA, as well as using QuickSync, and all the AVIs and everything else that we've been previously used to. There is a slight difference to do with QuickTime, which I'll explain in a minute. But apart from that, it's pretty much the same, it just does it in the background. You can use it for rendering, you can use it for exporting. The other thing that's happened is that we did have a feature under Render called Render and Add to Timeline, which is currently not there. Render and Add to Timeline is where I take that clip and it would render it and bung it on the timeline above it. At the moment, the GV Job Monitor just doesn't put anything back into Edius automatically, so it can't do that. So that has been removed. It may or may not come back in a future version of Edius 10. The other thing is that because the GV Job Monitor is a new way of doing stuff, you may need updated plugins, and the people who make the plugins might ask you to pay for it because they'll have to do some remaking to make it use the GV monitor properly. What I can tell you right now is obviously Vitascene LE and the new audio plugins which come with Edius, they work with it. Can't be sure of anything else. There will be a proper compatibility list coming out very soon after Edius 10 is released. Just check on my website for a link to that. But you'll probably have to pay for updates to your plugins to get it to work properly with Edius X, because the people who are making them will probably have to do some work to make them work with Edius X. Again, we'll know that better once the release has been out for a while. We do still have the batch export option inside of Edius, which is where you can lay out a list of different exports and then get them to all do them at once. Let's make an H.265 out of this and add it to the batch list. And then also maybe make an H.264 and add that to the batch list. And why not, let's make a ProRes. So you might say to yourself, well, I've got basically two lists of things being exported. Why do I need two lists? There is a subtle difference between the two. If you say export and you shove something into the GV monitor, what gets exported is what the timeline was looking like at the time. So for example, this ProRes file, that's what my sequence looked like at 9:46. Now maybe I was exporting it at 10:30. I could have bunged it into the GV monitor at 9:46, pressed the pause button so it didn't do anything, gone back into Edius, fiddled around with my sequence and done some stuff, and then come back in this and unpaused it. Well, the thing in the GV job monitor would have been as the project was at 9:46, not including everything I did afterwards. If I was to use this batch export, so I've added that to the batch export, I haven't yet pressed the export button. I then come back to Edius, which, you know, has currently got my couple of Vitascene effects on there. So let's make this a bit shorter maybe. Let's get rid of that Vitascene filter, add a title on top of it. So I've now changed the timeline. If I'd have paused the GV job monitor, it wouldn't have noticed any of that. But this batch export list would have done. I might have added this to the batch export of 946, but I pressed the export button right now. Well, it would have noticed all those changes. So it's a subtle difference. Do hope that's a clear explanation of the slight difference between the two. Most of the time, to be honest, I'm now not using batch export. A very good example of when I use batch export is my tutorials. I have 15 chapters, each one's going to be a movie, so I'll add them all to the batch export. I might then export them, find out I've made a mistake, so I then go back and make some changes, and because they're in the batch export, all I have to do is tick this and export, and it does it again without me having to faff around a lot. Name and all the settings and everything set. Whereas if I had to go to the GV job monitor again, I'd have to go through the print to file dialog box, check all the settings that I want, and then export it. So it's a slightly subtle difference, but that's kind of the difference between the two right now. The other way that you have of creating files in Edius is you can select files in the bin, right click and say convert, and then choose to convert it to some kind of file. Now I sometimes do this if I've got footage which is really hard to use. Maybe animated image sequences. Edius isn't very good at those, so I tend to convert them all in the bin. Well, you can come in here and do that and convert them. This doesn't use the job monitor yet. Probably will in a future version, but it doesn't. Everything else does use the job monitor. So all the renderings and everything else use the job monitor. But that's quite a huge change in Edius, and it's quite a time saver if you're doing a lot of exporting, because you can get on and work whilst the export is going on. I have had the occasional error, particularly when I'm using really old projects. I'm going to open up a project of something that I have been working on for many years with some friends. So I've got some plugins that I have used on some parts of this project, which I don't actually have anymore, because they used to be there with old versions of Edius and they aren't there now. Now you notice that error message that popped up when I went into it saying, hey, there's some plugins missing. If I try and export using the GV job monitor, and let's just choose going to, say, a Grass Valley HQ file, obviously lets me do it, and I can carry on working, but pull up the GV job monitor, and yep, it's starting to do it. It's thinking about it, and it failed. Why did it not work? Let's just double click on it, go to the details, and see what it says. Okay, this is what happened, blah, blah, blah. Oh, there are some effects missing. There's the Neat Video version 4 and the FX Home heat distortion effects are on the timeline. And they're not there anymore. Those are the plugins that it complained that I was missing. And I just ignored that message and carried on. Well, it won't export the whole thing because those plugins are missing. And the only way I can get it to export this timeline at the moment is basically to go back, find where they are on the timeline and delete them. Doesn't give you any more help than telling you those are the things that are missing. So now I've got to go through my entire timeline and find out where on this timeline those things were included and then delete them, which is basically go through and click on each clip at a time and find them. And because this is a very old project that I've opened up, I haven't the foggiest idea. So yeah, it's going to take me a little bit of time. But actually, there is no way of exporting this timeline now because it will fail every time you go to the job monitor. But it does tell you why it's failed. You just got to get rid of those and then it'll work. I mean, obviously this has got some information. It just says error. But if you double click on it, you'll get to some specifications of the job. And particularly you go to details, it does tell you there exactly what's going on. You know, when things were started and so on. Very useful dialog box to get to because it tells you why things didn't work. Other major new feature that we've got inside of Edius X is motion tracking in the layouter. Everybody always shows this off with a title, so I'm going to do exactly the same, but of course you can use it to stick anything on anything else. So if, for example, you had a way of sticking a lens flare inside of Edius, you could use it to stick a lens flare on something else. I am going to add a quick titler clip here. What I'm going to do is take these words and stick them on this guy's head. So he comes on, he walks across the screen, he disappears again. Now previously I could stick a mask on there and I could have tracked his head in the mask, but I could only do things like brighten it up or blur it or mosaic it. And now I can use the motion tracking in this title to track what's going on underneath it. So double click on the layouter and here you can see you've got a new thing called tracking. Now once you go into tracking you'll notice the whole thing's gone completely blank. That's because there's two modes. There's anchor mode and chase mode. So anchor mode you use on this layer, I'll talk about that in a second. Chase mode is what I need because I want to chase something on the layer below it and get something to follow that. So I'm going to go to a point where this guy's on screen. I'm going to just put my tracking around his head and then like I used to in the mask filter just come down to tracking here and say track it forward. And you can see now I've got a blob that is effectively following his head. I'm going to go back to there and track it backwards. If I get that out of the way, and you have a look at the playback window, you'll notice my title is now following his head. And if I didn't want it directly on his head, I'll just pop back into this, and I can use, say, the anchor point to move it up and down, and just reposition it. Now I use the anchor point, which just moves it around, and this is what I do in most motion tracking programs, is once I've tracked it using the anchor point. You can actually use the position, because the position is separate to the tracking data, which is quite interesting. You'll notice that actually after this tracking happened, there is a keyframe at the start and a keyframe at the end. So if I move along and I change the position of this so the words are up here, over the top of his head, that only affects it in the middle. So it starts on the side, moves to the top, and then goes down there, but it still follows his head as it does it. I've actually found both useful. Most of the time I just use the anchor position because it just moves it relative to where the tracking is. Sometimes I've used the position because I do want it to move around his head at the same time as being slightly offset from where it ended up after tracking. So you can use either of them. And actually this ability to move the position I found when I've been doing some effects actually really quite useful. Wish a few other programs would do that. I've also found the tracking to be very, very good. Motion tracking doesn't always work. It's the same in every program. I've had some occasions when the thing I'm tracking is actually a bit blurred and it can't track it. But most of the time I find this works really, really well. Fast and accurate. But that's great. The ability to stick something to a layer underneath it. Also, the way Edius works, it's not just working on this layer underneath it. If I was to have a second layer here, of course it's blotted out the first, so let's just make it smaller. And then I go into this thing to try and track stuff. It will track it off everything that's beneath it. So I could be tracking something in this smaller picture as opposed to something in this larger picture. The tracking basically works off of whatever it can see underneath it. It's also something that you can copy somewhere else. So let's make up a new clip. And I can just take that layout, shove it on there, and now the tracking from the original is on the new clip. Yeah, so for example in this case, maybe I'd use that to stick two titles on there, and now I've got, as you can see, two of them moving around. And I can use this on anything. I can use it to tag one video clip to another clip, or to take an image that I brought in from something else, maybe a lens flare or something, and then tag it, or maybe bring in a video of an explosion which I'm superimposing but trying to match onto the ground. You can use it for anything. It's really, really good. The other tracking option we have is to do with keeping something in the middle of the screen. So let's show you very quickly with this. I am going to go into tracking and I'm going to use anchor mode, and I'm going to just try and track this geezer here. Now if you look at what's happened there, it's keeping his head in the middle. So it's moving everything else around it. You know, having stabilized him in the middle of the screen, what I want to do is then just stick a little box around him and get rid of all the edges. So what I'm going to do is actually go to my list of filters and get hold of the transform filter. Now the transform filter is basically the layouter under another name, but it's not there automatically. But I can now use that to trim this down a bit and then maybe position him to one side. So the box is staying in the same place because the box and the position there is actually done by the transform filter. But what's happening inside the box, in other words my guy with his moving head, that is actually staying in the box all the time, despite the fact he moves his head all over the place. And that's really what the anchor mode is for. It's for finding a subject and keeping it centered. You'll notice as well on the transform filter, I say the transform is basically the layouter, but you can use it separately to the layouter. Or here you can notice I've also got tracking in that. So I can use the transform and I can use the layouter. I don't use the transform nearly as much as the layouter, but there have been occasions when I've needed to do it because I'll use the layouter to do one thing and then the transform to do something else like I did in this case. But yeah, that's two major new features that we've got inside of Edius. On top of that, we have got, as I used earlier, Vitascene LE added. It's added as a filter, so you've got a whole variety of tints and looks and old movie looks. All of these can be customized, of course, to give it different looks. And you've got a huge range of filters. There's starbursts and glows. And all of them, you just take it, you add it onto the clip. And then to get out of it, actually what you have to do is press F12 rather than exit. But now I've got that filter on the clip. And a lot of these will play in real time because it uses the graphics card to do a lot of the work. So I find that Vitascene in particular actually does play really, really well. Now, in addition to filters, you've also got a bunch of transitions. Now you've got Vitacine in there. There's actually quite a few more fancy transitions that have come in, particularly things like their smooth wipes. So let's choose that one for example. It's like the picture's kind of zooming across the screen with a motion blur, and then another one's popping up. And you've got lots of different things that you can fiddle around with and customize in here, as well as a lot of presets. But there's a huge amount of new extra fancy transitions. You've also got New Blue Titler Pro 7. We had 5 with Edius X, 7's more comprehensive, more features and more filters. The other thing we've got is a set of new audio filters. They call them Edius editions because they're specifically written for Edius. But they are some filters we've been really wanting for ages in Edius, and that's a compressor, a denoiser, a deverberator and a limiter. Now the fact that we have these new filters isn't the only new thing inside of Edius in terms of audio. The other thing is to do with how it deals with VST plugins. With Edius 9 and 8 and all the previous ones, there's always been a bit of a problem in that the way Edius deals with VST plugins means that there's a delay has been added to an awful lot of plugins. So effectively, you'd stick a plugin on the timeline and then it would cause the sound to be out of sync. Now that has been fixed with Edius X. So you shouldn't get a delay on any of these filters or on other VST filters that you put inside of Edius. Obviously it won't work with everything, nothing's perfect. They have improved Edius in the background to get rid of that delay as much as possible with all filters, which is great. So just looking at these 4 plugins, compressor will let you take any sound and kind of even it out. So let's take this particular clip here. I am going to take the compressor and pop it on there, open it up, and you can just choose a preset, which will just set the sliders for you. Actually carry on working. So you notice here, obviously going off and trimming this clip. So I've gone there from a very loud bit to a very quiet bit. If I turn it on, can actually carry on working. So you notice here, obviously going off and trimming this clip and sticking another one on there. And you can see what the compressor has done is it's made the very loud bit actually quite a lot closer to the very quiet bit. Now at the same time it is amplifying the noise slightly. I've chosen compression strong, so it's really whamping everything up and trying to level everything out. Let's use the medium preset here and see what that did. It goes purple, but you can actually carry on working. So you notice here, obviously going off and trim. There, I'm thinking the quiet bit is not quite as raised as it was. Yeah, there's slightly more difference between the two because I've chosen that. But effectively, all it's doing is setting these sliders. The threshold level will actually say, okay, at what level do we start worrying about this? So I've been looking at the level on the timeline, and yet, if it's under 20 dB, not going to worry about it. If it's over, I will. The ratio is how much do you start to level stuff. So the more you do that, the more it's going to sort of try and level things out. Can actually carry on working. So you notice here, obviously going off and trim. Well, now you do exactly the same thing. Right click and render. It goes purple, but now I put it right up to the top, which is, I would never ever do that. But if you listen very carefully to what the sound sounds like, suddenly the very loud bits are very sort of clipped and pretty awful. And the quiet bits, maybe they got louder, but you know, it's really not coming out too well. So 89, way too high. I'd probably go for 3 or 4 or something. The attack time is really, okay, how far ahead are you looking? If you go really small on this, then it's going to make changes very quickly, and that might sound a bit bitty and a bit jumpy. If you go very long, it's going to miss stuff. So you'll actually be getting into a bit that needs to be louder, but it'll be quiet at the start and then get louder. Or you'll get into a bit that needs to be quieter and it'll be loud and then quiet. So, you know, you fiddle around with this to get something that sounds good. The attack time is kind of going in. The release time is as it comes out of your loud bit. What does it do? How does it get quieter or louder after the thing that it's fiddled with? Again, these two, they're in milliseconds. Tend to leave these as they are. I tend to fiddle with the threshold level and the ratio. Forget those two completely. But you can, if you're getting it so it feels like it's sort of adjusting it too quickly, you can make these a bit longer. Or if it's not adjusting it quick enough, you can make them a bit smaller and see what it sounds like. And then the makeup level. You know, with the ratio, you'll be saying, okay, take the loud bits down and the quiet bits up and bring them closer together. Well, if you make the loud bits quieter, the whole thing's going to be quieter. So the makeup level is it's saying, right, after leveling it out, then raise the whole thing by a certain amount. It's raising it by 6 dBs here, which is what this particular preset does. So the whole thing then goes back to being a decent level. So again, just to give you an idea what that is, if I play it without, I'm bringing up the levels meter here as well so you can see it, but let's play this and then be able to get on with my work. Well, now you do exactly the same thing, right click and render. Now the volume levels, the peaks here and here are actually about the same. It sounds a bit different, but their volume level is about the same. If I go to the quieter bits here and play those and you look at the levels, you notice here obviously going off. It's only down here. But with the compressor on, the quieter bits, so you notice here, obviously going off, are going a bit higher up. So that's it's doing its job. It's making the quieter bits louder and the louder bits quieter. But the overall level's about the same because the makeup's on. If I turn the makeup down and then play it, right click and render, it goes purple, but you can actually carry on working. You'll notice all the levels are now down here. Without the filter at all, the loud bits are up here. With the filter and no makeup, the loud bits are only here, whereas before they were up here. So what the makeup does is to make everything back to having a reasonable loudness. It's like a volume control, if you like, on the results of the compressor. And of course you can whack that right up if you want it really, really loud. Normally what I would have done is right clicked and chosen render and made a hideous, horrible noise. But you can see the volume has got louder. But that's really how a compressor works. So your threshold level determines kind of where you start working. The ratio is how much you even it out, and then the makeup level is taking the results and then bringing the volume back up again after compressing it. But compressors are very useful. I use them all the time on things like this tutorial because my voice goes up and down and up and down, and you really don't want that level of variation in your final result. You want it nice and clean. This one works really, really well. Obviously the next thing we've got is a denoiser. Now on this clip, if you can hear it, from Vitacine LE, which is included. It's actually quite nice and clean. I have got a decent mic and I'm talking right into it, but it's still a bit of a hiss. Shove on the denoiser and, okay, well it happens to be playing and it clears it up. Now with some denoisers you can open it up and then you can sample a particular noise that you've got in the background and then try and get it to use that. This denoiser doesn't do that at all. This denoiser basically works it out automatically and it does a very good job. So there's not much to fiddle with. It's literally throw it on, listen to it, fiddle with the reduction amount. So obviously it's deciding what the noise is and getting rid of it for you. But if you fiddle with the reduction amount, you might get rid of more of it. Anyway, but suppose I needed to render it. But you can see what happens. If I put that reduction too high, you can see what actually happens to the voice. It really sounds very, very weird. So obviously you put it on there and you fiddle with this so you get an acceptable result. So to get rid of a lot of noise, maybe you'll have to whack it up, but maybe it'll just become so sort of tinny and computerized that it's not very good. So it's not a magic thing, but it's great. It's nice and simple and does clean up noise. The limiter, again, very simple thing. It will actually limit the audio level to a particular level. So, I'm looking at this thing through here and it goes up and it goes down, and there might be some bits in here where it goes a bit too loud and it peaks into the red. A limiter is going to say, yeah, I am going to limit the level to be minus 6 dB. Let's just type it, minus 6. And now it doesn't matter what I do with the program itself. It's gone from purple to green. It's actually been rendered and put together and I didn't even notice. No matter what I do, this will not go over 6 dB. Now this is not the same as a compressor. A compressor will even things out. This literally just limits it to make sure it won't go over a certain level, which is very important for a lot of things, particularly if you're going to go to broadcast. You do not want things to go over certain levels. This will limit it for you. The output level is set through this one. Release time, same as it was in the other filter, it just determines how aggressive it is in its limiting. And the input level will actually raise the volume of the clip. So again, this is not a compressor. It's not going to raise the quiet bits and the loud bits. It's just going to raise everything by the same amount. So the hiss and everything. If I whack that up to say there, I'm whacking everything up by 18 decibels. So it was a pretty good level in the first place. This should probably go into the red. Using a thing which is called the GV Job Monitor. So it's got hugely louder, but it still hasn't gone into the red because it's still stopping at minus 6, which is the point of this. Doesn't matter what you do to the clip. I could come into here, so turn that off, come into the clip and whack up the gain. Huge, blocky, awful waveform down there. It's going to sound atrocious. Been rendered and put together and I didn't even notice. It's still limited to 6 dB. Okay, sounds awful, but it's not going over 6 dB. Personally, I would tend to, well, not do that for a start, because that was stupid. What I would do on my voiceover, I tend to put the denoise on first, make sure I can get rid of the hiss, so then I'd open it up, fiddle with the reduction, make sure it sounds okay. Then I'd put the compressor on, and I decide on the sort of level, how much I want the ratio to be, how much I want to make it up. Again, fiddle with these three things depending on what it sounds like. And then I would put the limiter on just to make sure I don't go over a specific amount. Now for my web stuff, I go quite high. I go -2, which is way too high for broadcast. But for other things, you'll set different levels. But I tend to put a combination of those three on, and then I get a decent result on my voice at the end. And opening up, and in the background, Edius is actually doing some encoding. The level there is nicely evened out, it sounds pretty good, it's not going over the top because of my limiter, and it's been denoised, and I would tend to use those a lot. I would actually probably save that lot as a preset, which I can then throw onto every clip. Now the other thing we've got is a deverberator. Now what a deverberator does is basically tries to get rid of the echo effect that you can get on some recordings. The best way of getting decent sound is to do it properly in the first place. All this stuff is just to try and clean up things afterwards. Let's take an extreme example. A really old shot that I've got here that was filmed in a very echoey dome.
Grab that thing and put this on.
I'm going to take the D-reverb, shove it on there, open it up and see what happens. Fix big hall reverb. Let's try that preset. I mean, okay, this sounds over-processed because it was a really, really, really horrible reverb in the first place, but I can actually now hear his voice without much reverb. In this case, that's too much, so maybe I'll just change the level and try and get something acceptable out of it. Apart from some presets, you've got some very simple controls. You've got the level of the reverb, which you can click and leave on automatic and it'll work it out for you, and how much reverb you're trying to get rid of. Works really good on subtle reverbs, hideous reverbs like this. It's really going to struggle, but then everything will as well. But it's pretty simple. Again, you just adjust the reverb level, the reverb time, or you choose a preset. But there's 4 very nice new useful features inside of Edius, and because of the new way we're dealing with VST plugins inside of Edius, they don't add a delay onto the audio, so that you can use them on your projects, which is great. Some of the other new things inside of Edius we have touched on, like on the print to file, we can now do H.265 encoding using an NVIDIA graphics card, which previously you could only do if you had QuickSync. Now, I have got QuickSync on this system, so I can do both. I haven't really made a decision on which one actually does the better quality, but if you haven't got QuickSync, now you can make H.265, which you didn't before. There isn't anything else added to do with NVIDIA graphics cards, really. There might be more in the future, but as yet, there isn't anything else. So you're still not getting the same level of acceleration as you do with QuickSync. So for example, the way it can use the QuickSync to decode H.265 and play it properly, that is only working with QuickSync and not with H.265. It's exactly the same with H.264. But maybe more will be coming in the future. Right now that's the only thing. And it's only on NVIDIA graphics cards and only on recent NVIDIA graphics cards. There are also limitations on the actual cards themselves as to what kind of clips they can create. So some of the older cards can only make clips with IMP frames, some can make IBP ones. But maybe that speaks in the future of more and more stuff will be accelerated with graphics cards. We won't really know till it happens. Another thing which has been removed is Edius will no longer use QuickTime even if it is installed on your system. With Edius 9 you could come into these settings here, find QuickTime and tick it. It won't do that now. It has been a year or two since the FBI said get rid of QuickTime, it's a virus. Effectively, nearly everybody else has dumped it, and now Edius won't let you use it at all either. It's written its own QuickTime support, which for me works for now everything that I throw at it. I used to have problems with some formats which weren't being read if I didn't have the QuickTime thing ticked. Now I don't, and in fact I am also able to read QuickTime Cineform files. If QuickTime was ticked in Edius 9, I couldn't read QuickTime Cineform files. Now I can, which is actually very useful because I've got some programs where that's one of the best options for exporting, HitFilm for example. I either have to do uncompressed or QuickTime Cineform, which QuickTime Cineform saves me a lot of space, and I can load that into Edius quite happily now. I couldn't if actually QuickTime was installed and I ticked it. But it's gone, which is pretty much what everybody else has been doing, because QuickTime for Windows will soon disappear completely from the world and everybody will have forgotten it existed. On the hardware front, you'll notice here I actually happen to have two Blackmagic devices plugged in. I can only use one at a time, but I have got a really old Intensity Pro plugged in, still works quite happily, but some other older cards don't work anymore. Particularly, you can't use Matrox cards with Edius anymore. Now, since Edius X is Windows 10 only, and Matrox don't even do Pucker drivers for Windows 10, what is the point of supporting it anymore? And you haven't been able to buy a Matrox device for several years, so it really didn't make much more sense to carry on supporting it. Well, they're not supported anymore, and a couple of old Grass Valley cards aren't supported anymore either. You'll find most of the rest of the stuff basically the same as it was in previous versions. Another thing that's good is they haven't reworked basics. All the basics have stayed the same, everything's in the same place. All these buttons and everything all just got migrated over from my Edius 9 that was on the same system quite happily and carried on working. You don't have to relearn stuff, you only have to learn the new stuff. That's a quick summary of what's new in Edius X. There will be more over the lifetime of it. You can order it right now from my website. When you buy from my website, you're actually buying directly from the distributors of Edius, Magic Multimedia, and I just act as an agent and I'll give you help if you've got problems installing it. But you can order it off my website now and then you can download it straight away. Obviously you can get my Edius tutorial half price if you order it through my website as well, which I will be updating with more in-depth information about the Edius 10 features. Anyway, that's a quick guide to the new features of Edius X. Hope you found it useful and I'll see you next time.